Hi, I'm Duncan Moss, and I'd like to welcome you to my latest video blog. Today I'll be slightly different from anything I presented before. I'll be talking about my love for the author Jane Austen, which is a rather unusual beaten path from science fiction and but I fell in love with her work when I started to study Emma for A level, which was in 1979, and I've still got my Penguin A level uh, version of Emma, which is one of my favourite novels. Um, she only actually completed six um, contemporary novels, and only four of these were published during her lifetime. She was born in 1775 in Hampshire, where she spent, I think it is the first 20 years of her life. Her father was a clergyman, and she was one of several children. I think she had five brothers and one sister. And from a very early age, she expressed an interest in writing and wanted very much to be an author, which was in those days a rather unusual thing for a lady to do. It wasn't considered very ladylike, and certainly not to be a career author. If you were a lady and you wrote, well, that was just a little sideline from being a mother and a wife. And very sadly, Jane would become neither would be neither a wife or a mother, but she was an aunt. And her first major work, well, she was writing from about, I think it was 1797 onwards, maybe a little earlier than that even. She's in her teens, and she wrote a novel. I can't recall what it was called. I've never read it, but it was using. She also wrote a short story called Lady Susan, and these were using sort of diary entries the plot characters writing. It was journals and stuff, and that's how the novel was presented, by characters writing. And it was considered a medium that she didn't feel very comfortable writing. And it went out of fashion until towards the end of the 19th century, when a certain Bram Stoker presented his novel Dracula in that format and had tremendous success with it. Just shows nothing ever goes out of fashion. Just trying to. This is it. I can't find it so difficult to look at. Uh, Things. It's Love and Friendship was her first sort of novel, although it never got published during her lifetime. And she wrote a six-act play. She wrote several short stories. A lot of them were to amuse her family. And but by 1811, she had her first major novel published, and that was Sense and Sensibility. And about 2 years later, Pride and Prejudice. There were different formats and ways you could have your novel published. You could have a commission, which meant that you, as an author, and anybody who was backing your project, took the risk, the majority of the risk. And there were other ways where and what they would do, the publishers, they were renowned if in this situation to publish the books on really good, expensive paper, because then they weren't the ones taking the risk. But if there was another alternative arrangement, then they would keep their costs down as much as they possibly could and use very cheap paper. And a novel in those days, this was long before the days of Penguin and W.H. Smith. If you wanted to buy a novel, they cost you about 62 quid. In this day's money. So they were. This was the beginning of the 19th century. As the century progressed, more and more people learned to read. Cheaper ways of publishing, printing novels came out, and there was a literature explosion from mid 19th century onwards, the same way that cinema exploded in the 20th century. And Sense and Sensibility was a success, and so was Pride and Prejudice. And she published two more novels during her lifetime, Mansfield Park and Emma. Now, I like Mansfield Park very much. It's a story of a very frightened little lady called Fanny Price, who lives with her cousins and in Mansfield Park, and the family are not very nice to her, except for cousin Edmund, who is training to be a vicar. Or I think he is a vicar by the time. But in the story, I think it was published in a newspaper or a journal originally. And Jane Austen she ends part one of the novel with a cliffhanger. And what the cliffhanger is Fanny's uncle has gone off on business, and one of the cousins has brought some friends round to stay in Mansfield Park, and they're a group of actors, and they are preparing to put on a review or a concert of some sort, and they're rehearsing. And the father, who is not meant to be back for 3 weeks, has finished his business a little earlier than originally planned and is on his way back home, and is coming up the driveway when the novel part one comes to an end on a cliffhanger. And you think, what's wrong with that? Well, in the early 19th century, if you came back from business, you were a respected man your family were greatly respected in the community, and you suddenly found that your house was full of actors, that could be something you didn't want to proclaim from the rooftops. In fact, if you got out, you would got to be local gossip. You could be very unhappy bunny indeed. In those days, acting was considered a very notorious profession. The church had never been a fan of actors. In fact, there was a time when the Roman Catholic Church refused to give a Holy Communion to actors unless they were dying. And if they survived, they were expected to come up with another profession. So that was a wonderful way of putting having a cliffhanger. I won't explain what happens, not because I don't want a spoiler alert, because I can't flipping remember what happens. But Emma is a lovely novel about a young lady who has lost her mum at an early age and is spoilt rotten by her father, who's a bit of Mr. Woodhouse, who is a bit of a hypochondriac. Emma is brought up by her governess, who then marries Captain Weston, and then Emma is left without a governess, a sort of a friend to keep her on the straight and narrow. And although she is well-meaning, she has lots of ideas about the matchmaking people and all sorts of things don't go well for her. There's two very respected characters, Mr. Knightley and his younger brother, Mr. John Knightley, who doesn't have perhaps the charm of his older brother, but is still a really good sort. There's Miss Bates, who is a very jolly, bubbly, almost ridiculous lady who looks after her mother, Mrs. Bates, and has a very low income in the village of Highbury where they all live, which is basically Leatherhead. And what happens is that a whole load of the characters go up Box Hill. Now, Miss Bates is in what we call a very vulnerable character. She's missed the chance of being married. She's got a low income. She looks after her aging mum. She's what you call a vulnerable person. And despite her vulnerability, she's very, very happy to be with her lot. She's always delighted to see everybody, but she's a very bubbly, friendly, perhaps almost silly character. But they go on a picnic, a load of them, up to Box Hill, and what happens is they end up playing a game of charades, and or something based on charades, and one of each person playing has got to come up with something silly. And Miss Bates says, "Oh, something silly. I won't have any problem with that. I say so many silly things." And Emma replies to her, "Pray, ma'am, we only require one." And Miss Bates is very, very upset. It's quite clear from her reply that she's very hurt. And Captain Weston tries to steer it all onto something else. But Mr. Knightley, who's one of the few people who ever talks to Emma about her faults, is disgusted. And as she's got into the carriage, he's not going to be riding in the carriage with her. But he talks to her through the window and gives her quite a hard time over basically putting down in front of people a very vulnerable person. And this is perhaps she wants to say that she's sorry and asks Mr. Knightley for advice as what to do next. But the carriage shoots off before she can carry on the conversation. It's a lovely, lovely story. There's one bit in the book where Emma receives a terrible, terrible shock, and she uses the words "good God." Now, in 1816, when the novel was published, that would have been considered very strong stuff indeed. The novel was her last novel to be published during her lifetime, and the Prince Regent asked for her to dedicate it to him. And none of her books were ever published with her name on during her lifetime. And Sir Walter Scott was the first person to mention her name in writing in a review, praising her work. And he's the same guy who wrote Ivanhoe. And some of her books started to get published in France, but they were so badly translated that the plots ended up getting changed because nobody could understand. The person translating had a very poor knowledge of English, so that wasn't. But eventually, they were officially published properly. I think they were pirated books, the originals. Sadly, Jane Austen died, I think she was 42, in 1817, with two books she completed. Sorry about that. We've got some idiot driving down Sopwith Avenue. It's only 20 miles an hour limit, and they're going like they were Epperson Pity Paldy. or Barry Sheen. Of course, they didn't have motorbikes in Jane Austen's time, um, but she Northanger Abbey uh, and Persuasion were published after she had died by her brother. I think it was Henry, her brother, and she hadn't been ever. She was never rich during her life. In fact, sometimes the family were in quite a bad way financially, almost like some of the risks that happened to some of her characters. Northanger Abbey was a Mickey take on Gothic novels, which were very popular from the late 18th and early 19th centuries. They were sort of the equivalent to what horror movies and thrillers were to us. They had a hero, a vulnerable heroine, a baddie with a black cape and a long moustache. Probably had horse chases in them, and a heroine trapped in a dungeon in the bad guy's castle, and Jane Austen pokes fun at Gothic novels in Northanger Abbey. One of the characters, Catherine Morland, who is a very impressionable young lady with a very overactive imagination, likes reading Gothic novels. And she has a friend who's reading two books at the moment. One of them, a novel called Necromancer of the Woods, and an anthology book of short stories called Horrid Mysteries. And because she's so impressionable, Catherine, she sees things that basically aren't there and predicts it works really well. It's basically Northanger Abbey is basically to the Gothic novel what Airplane is to the airport disaster movies, a complete spoof and send up. And basically her novels went out of print in the UK in the 1820s, but from the 1830s they were reprinted, and they've never been out of print since, and they're very, very popular. So we've got Sense and Sensibility in 1811, and Pride and Prejudice in 1813. I think Mansfield Park in 1815, and Emma in 1815, and then in I think late 1817, after she died, I think Northanger Abbey and Persuasion came out as a set. Persuasion is the shortest novel, and I think some editions of it have letters. She wrote lots of letters to her sister Cassandra, who burnt a lot of them. Some of them, her letters that survive, are put in as an appendix for Persuasion, depending what issue, what versions you get. But people collect them a bit the same way they do Lord of the Rings. You get various different editions, and I've got here. This is quite a funny one. This is people started writing horror versions of her stories. I think one's been made into a film. And I think she would have found that really funny. Since she sent up Gothic novels, I think she'd have had a good old laugh at that. Sanditon, which was the novel that she was writing when she became too ill to continue writing, has been published. Basically, she only got a third of the way through it, which was very sad. And people have had attempts to finish it off. Not from what I can gather with great success, but television writers have been able to continue with the story. It's set in a health spa, and she's basically, they think she was poking fun at the fact at illness because she knew she was dying, and She did Mr. Woodhouse, Emma's father in Emma. He's a bit of a hypochondriac, and some of her characters are hypochondriacs. The series it's been made into a very successful television series, which I think went around for at least 2 series, maybe 3, maybe I don't know whether it's still in production. Of course, several adaptations of her works. The 1938 or 37 MGM version of Pride and Prejudice with Laurence Olivier as Mr. Darcy. No, I'm afraid it doesn't work at all. But obviously the BBC adaptation with Colin Firth did. And there's they are wonderful characters, and most of her plots hinge on the characters rather than actual physical situations. But do give her a try. If you've never read any of her work, Jane Austen is fabulous, and do give her a try. They're romantic comedies. She observed her family were really what is called the gentry, a sort of middle class, but not so high up the scale, but fairly people who would worry about their daughters marrying well, because you wouldn't be needed. It'd be difficult for you to have enough money to live on if you hadn't got arranged a good marriage, and she observed people interacting when she went to balls and things, and she never wrote a scene in any of her books with 2 men talking to each other alone, because she never saw that. You have men talking to each other, but it's in front of other characters, other ladies and stuff. She was devastated when she moved from her lovely house in Hampshire in her, I think, early 20s. She went to live in Bath, and I don't think she liked Bath at all. That's why you have a character called Mrs. Elton in Emma, who is the height of vulgarity, and she comes from Bath, and it doesn't look like she liked Bath at all. And I say, when she passed away, I think it was in Chichester when she passed away. And she was surrounded, I think she had her nephews and nieces coming in to see her. They moved her, I think, to Chichester because they thought that health would be better for her health. And she passed away. She's only 42. Yes, it would have been lovely if she'd written a whole load of more novels. Becoming Jane is a lovely movie, well worth seeing. You could say that maybe that's a different format in the cinema. That acts as the 7th Jane Austen novel, and as I say, I don't know everything about her. This is to make you dip into, perhaps to invite you to get into her work and have a look. I would say you don't have to read them in chronological order. They weren't written in chronological order, so I would start off with Emma. It's lovely, or Northanger Abbey, but the choice is yours. But just don't not read any of them. Give her a try. I think you'll be. I think that she's for everybody. Anyhow, if you like this, please subscribe to my video channel if you haven't already done so. Take the like button or forward this to a friend if you think it'll be any use to them. Anyway, I'm signing off now. God bless. Bye-bye.